You might think the wilderness is peaceful, just trees, wind, and solitude. But deep within, there are stories no one should hear in the dark. These aren't ghost tales, but true accounts from wilderness guides who faced something worse than nature, the madness of people, disappearances, violence, evil. This isn't for entertainment, it's a warning. Because in the forest, the scariest sound isn't a scream, it's silence. Story 1. The client who lost control deep in the woods. I had been guiding in the wilderness for nearly a decade, and over the years I'd come to rely on a certain rhythm, a quiet, predictable cadence that the forest offered if you knew how to listen. That morning began like many others. The air was crisp, still holding the scent of recent rainfall, and the forest trail shimmered with damp leaves and a hint of morning fog curling between the trunks. I stood at the trailhead checking my gear. Everything in place, and first aid kit, radio, map, knife, the usual checklist a guide runs through without thought. I was expecting to head out alone that day, a solo recon hike to prepare for an upcoming group tour, when a car pulled into the empty gravel lot. It was odd. Last-minute bookings were rare, and even rarer on isolated trails like this one. A man stepped out, pale, disheveled, clothes wrinkled and mismatched like they'd been thrown on in a panic. His shoes were urban, slick-soled, and useless for rough terrain. He didn't belong here. I gave a curt nod as he approached, trying to mask my concern behind professionalism. Whatever his reason for being there, he'd paid for my time. That made him my responsibility. Still, something about the way he looked at the trees, not with awe but with something closer to dread, planted a quiet unease in my stomach. I shook it off. People get nervous in the woods. I told myself it was nothing. The trail twisted, gently through dense woodland, the kind of terrain that usually soothed newcomers with its filtered light and earthy silence. At first, the man kept pace beside me, saying little, which I appreciated. I preferred my client's quiet, let the forest do the talking. But not long into the hike, I began to notice things that didn't sit right. He kept shifting his eyes from side to side, barely registering the trail ahead. Every few minutes, he'd stop suddenly and glance over his shoulder, like he'd heard something behind us. At one point, I asked if he was okay. His answer was stiff. Fine. No eye contact, no elaboration, just that one word, clipped and strained. His breathing was a little heavier than expected, but it wasn't exertion. It was something else, tight, shallow, like fear held in his chest. He walked with a strange tension in his shoulders, as if expecting something to leap from the brush. I slowed my pace to accommodate him, watching as he stumbled slightly on a root, catching himself too late. He muttered something I didn't catch, maybe a name, maybe a curse. The further we went, the more disconnected he seemed. I'd seen nervous hikers before, city people not used to the wild, but this was different. He wasn't afraid of the trail. He was afraid of something on the trail. He flinched at shadows, stared too long at tree trunks like he expected faces to emerge from the bark. My instinct told me to end the hike early, but I hesitated. Maybe he just needed time to adjust. Still, with every step, the forest felt tighter around us, and the back of my neck prickled like the trees themselves were watching, or maybe worse, like something else was. It happened so fast that for a moment I wasn't sure it was real. 1 second we were walking in silence, the distant caw of a raven echoing through the trees. The next, he stopped dead in his tracks. I turned to check on him, ready to ask if he needed another break when he lunged at me. There was no warning, no shout, no signal, just a raw explosion of movement. His eyes were wide, almost unseeing, and twisted with something that looked like pure panic or fury. I staggered back, instinctively raising my arms as he clawed at my jacket, screaming incoherently. His voice cracked and broken like static from a damaged radio. I shouted, something desperate, a command, maybe his name, but it didn't register. He wasn't listening, he wasn't there. I slipped on the damp undergrowth, nearly falling as he came at me again. My hand reached instinctively for the knife strapped to my belt, fingers grazing the handle, but I froze. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was unarmed. Whatever this was, it wasn't calculated aggression. It was a full-blown breakdown. If I pulled that knife even to defend myself, there was no going back, and yet I couldn't let him get close again. I backed away slowly, speaking low, trying to de-escalate. "Hey, you're okay. Nobody's here but us. You're safe." But he wasn't listening. His gaze darted to the trees like they were whispering to him, like something unseen was urging him on. I stepped sideways through the clearing, trying not to trip, all my senses screaming. My heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the sounds of the forest. I thought of how far we were from help, from cell service, from anyone. We were alone, and he was unraveling right in front of me. He circled me like a predator unsure of its prey, arms twitching, breath ragged. I kept moving, watching for a moment of stillness, a sign that he might come back to himself. But there was nothing, just that madness in his eyes, like he was looking at something just behind me. I didn't dare look back. Whatever he saw, I prayed it wasn't real, and if it was, I didn't want to see it. I ran. I didn't wait for another lunge, didn't gamble on one more second of reasoning with someone who wasn't even in his own mind. The moment his posture shifted again, shoulders tightening, hands clawing at the air, I turned and bolted into the trees. Branches whipped against my face. Thorns caught on my sleeves, roots threatened to pull me down, but I didn't stop. Behind me I could hear him crashing through the brush, shouting something incomprehensible, a sound that didn't even feel human. My breath came in sharp, burning gulps, and every heartbeat echoed like a drum inside my skull. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to move, had to survive. Somehow, my feet found the path again, and I followed it blindly, guided by instinct and adrenaline. By the time I stumbled onto the gravel access road near the edge of the woods, my legs felt like rubber. My shirt was soaked in sweat, streaked with dirt and blood from low-hanging branches. The sun was beginning to sink, casting long shadows across the treetops, and for a second, I thought I saw something shift behind them. I didn't look twice. I walked the last mile to base in a daze, barely able to focus. When I saw the canvas roof of our main outpost rise into view between the trees, I nearly collapsed. Radios buzzed faintly inside. The normalcy of it felt unreal. I had made it back, but I wasn't sure if all of me had returned. That night, I sat alone in the far corner of the tent, away from the soft murmur of the other guides and the comfort of routine. I couldn't stop replaying the moment he lunged, the madness in his eyes, the scream that didn't sound like it came from a man. I should have seen it coming, I kept telling myself. Should have noticed the signs, his distant stare, the panic in his breathing, the tremor in his hands. Maybe I could have stopped it, done something differently, but a darker voice inside me whispered something else. You did what you had to do. Out there I made a choice, not to fight, not to harm him, just to run, to live. And though I survived, I couldn't shake the shame that came with leaving him behind. Was it cowardice or restraint? Would I have drawn that knife if he'd gotten any closer? I don't know. I still don't. The senior guide told me I did the right thing, that some people break in the wild, but the truth is, part of me broke out there too. In the silence of the forest, I discovered how thin the line is between mercy and self-preservation. Story 2. The German Man in the Shadow of the FBI. I've guided hundreds of clients through the Montana wilderness, families, thrill seekers, loners trying to find themselves. Most of them blur together over the years. But not him. The moment, I laid eyes on the German. I felt it in my chest, that tight little knot that comes when something just feels off. He was older, maybe late 50s, neatly dressed in muted tones with a canvas jacket and sturdy boots. Nothing flashy, nothing obviously wrong, but it was the way he carried himself. Calm but too calm. Not nervous, not excited. Just neutral, like someone walking into a courtroom rather than an adventure. His handshake was brief, his gaze steady but hollow, like he wasn't really looking at me. He spoke English fluently but minimally, with a clipped accent and a formality. That made every sentence sound rehearsed. When I asked what brought him to that part of Montana, he simply replied personal reasons and offered nothing more. That wasn't unusual. Some clients don't want to chat, but it was the stillness around him that got under my skin. Even as I checked our packs and ran through the safety briefing, he stood there with his hands folded behind his back, like he'd done this before. Like he knew the trail better than I did. As we set off, the silence between us wasn't peaceful, it felt weighted. I couldn't say why, but something about him made the trees feel closer, the air heavier and the trail ahead less familiar than it had ever felt before. The trail we took wasn't well known, not the kind you'd find marked on visitor maps or blogs. It wound through thick pine forest, up into a high ridge that only locals and seasoned hikers ever really bothered with. Yet from the moment we started, it was clear the German didn't need me. He walked a few paces behind, not because he couldn't keep up, but as if he was deliberately staying back, like he was retracing a path he'd already walked. When we reached forks in the trail, he didn't wait for direction. His eyes would flick toward the correct route with unsettling confidence, even before I could say a word. I chalked it up to chance at first. Some people have good intuition, but after the third time, it began to gnaw at me. I asked if he'd been here before. He paused, then gave a small nod and said, "Once long ago." There was no elaboration. His tone made it clear the subject was closed. As we moved deeper into the woods, the usual sounds of the forest, bird calls, the rustle of squirrels began to fade. The stillness crept in gradually like mist, until the only sound was our footsteps on the leaf-strewn path. Every so often, I'd glance back and catch him staring into the trees, his expression unreadable. Not lost, not scared, focused, expectant. He muttered to himself sometimes, mostly in German. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was soft, almost reverent. I knew then this hike wasn't about the view or the challenge. He wasn't here to explore, he was returning to something, or someone. We reached the final stretch by late afternoon, the sun hanging low and cold in the western sky. The ridge came into view, jagged rocks lined with scraggly trees, rising like ancient spines against the horizon. As we climbed the last incline, the forest behind us seemed to fall silent altogether. Even the wind had died. The stillness was unnerving. Just before the summit, the German stopped. He turned to me and for the first time that day gave me a direct order. "You wait here." His voice was calm, but there was no room for argument. I nodded, more relieved than offended. My chest had been tight with unease since we began our ascent, and I had no interest in walking those final steps. I watched him continue, slow and steady, his boots crunching softly against loose gravel. He reached the top and stood there, motionless. No surveying the view, no triumphant sigh. He simply stood, arms at his sides, head tilted slightly upward, as if listening for something. Minutes passed. The wind didn't return, he didn't move. I felt like an intruder watching a ritual I wasn't meant to witness. At one point, I thought I saw his lips move just slightly as though whispering to the air. A quiet prayer? A name? I couldn't tell. But something about the moment felt heavy, charged, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. And Then, without warning, he turned and made his way back down. His face was blank, but his eyes, they were different, darker, deeper, like he had seen something up there that the rest of us were never meant to understand. 2 weeks after the hike, just as the strange weight of it had begun to loosen its grip on my thoughts, there was a knock at my door. Sharp, deliberate, too forceful to be casual. I opened it to find 2 men in dark suits standing on my porch. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence felt heavy, official. One of them flashed a badge, FBI. My stomach dropped. They asked if I was the guide who had taken a man, German, mid-50s, grey eyes, into the mountains earlier that month. When I nodded, the taller agent said, "We need you to come with us. There are some questions you need to answer." No explanation, no delay. I grabbed my coat and phone and was escorted into a black SUV waiting at the curb. The drive was silent, tense. I racked my brain for what could possibly have happened. Had the man gone missing? Committed a crime? Died? We arrived at a nondescript federal building where I was led into a cold room with fluorescent lights and a single metal table. One agent stayed with me while the other left, returning minutes later with a manila folder. He slid a photograph across the table. It showed a much younger man, dark hair, hard eyes, but I didn't recognize him. I told them as much. They stared at me, searching for any sign of a lie. Then they pulled out a second photo. This one hit me like a punch. It was the German, but older, very old. I confirmed it was him, and the 2 agents exchanged a glance that said more than words ever could. Whatever I had been part of, it wasn't over, and it was much bigger than I'd imagined. They drove me home just after sunset. The taller agent handed me a plain white card with a number on it and said, "If anything comes back to you, anything at all, his call." I nodded, still stunned, my mind spiraling. As their SUV pulled away into the night, I stood alone in my driveway, staring at the card like it might give me answers. But it didn't, and neither had they. They hadn't told me who the man really was, only that it was a matter of national security. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about his eyes and how calm they were when he came back down from that ridge, and yet how different. He had looked through me, not at me. What had he seen up there? What had he heard? And why had the FBI come knocking so fast, with photos already prepared? Was he a fugitive, a spy, or something even more unexplainable? I replayed every moment of the hike in my head, searching for signs I'd missed, a phrase, a gesture, anything. But the truth is, I hadn't guided that man through the forest. He'd let me walk beside him while he returned to something I never should have witnessed. And now I can't unsee it. Every time I close my eyes, I see him standing. There, motionless, listening to the windless silence. And sometimes in the middle of the night, I swear I hear it too. Story 3. Carrying an unconscious stranger through the night forest. The tour had gone well. No twisted ankles, no sudden storms, no complaints. After saying goodbye to the group, I decided to take one last walk alone. It was my favorite part of guiding. The quiet after everyone had left, when the woods returned to stillness and felt like mine again. The late afternoon light filtered through the branches, casting long golden shadows across the trail. I rounded a bend, lost in thought, when something made me stop cold. At first I thought it was a shadow or a fallen log, but then I saw the shape of a man lying just off the trail, half hidden by brush. His limbs were limp, his hiking clothes dusty and damp. I dropped my pack and rushed over, heart pounding. His skin was pale, his breath shallow, and when I touched his forehead it was cold and slick with sweat. I called out, shaking his shoulder gently. No response. My training kicked in, but my instincts were already screaming. Something was very wrong. Maybe he'd collapsed from dehydration or heat stroke or worse. There was no cell service in this part of the forest, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I had seconds to make a choice. I knelt beside him, pulse racing, my fingers trembling as I checked for injuries. No blood, no visible wounds, but he was completely unresponsive, dead weight against the earth. I reached for my radio out of habit, but I already knew what I'd hear. Static. This part of the forest was a blind zone, cut off from even the faintest signal. The ranger station was more than 3 miles out, over rough and winding trail. I glanced down at the man again, unconscious and vulnerable. I couldn't leave him here. The forest got cold fast after sundown, and predators, both animal and human, weren't unheard of. "All right," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "We're doing this." I pulled open my pack, using cord and gear straps to fashion a makeshift sling across my back. I crossed his arms over his chest and, with a grunt of effort, hoisted him onto me. He was heavier than he looked. The weight pressed into my spine and shoulders, unfamiliar and demanding, but I'd carried gear just as heavy, though never with a life depending on it. I adjusted his position, locked my legs, and started walking. Every step would count, every root, every incline, every shift of his limp body would be a new test. But I couldn't stop now. This was no longer a hike. This was a rescue. And I was the only one out here to carry it through. The forest changed quickly as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. What had been a quiet, peaceful trail during daylight now became a gauntlet of shadow and shifting noise. With every step I took, the unconscious man on my back seemed to grow heavier. My muscles burned, my lungs fought for air, and sweat soaked through my shirt despite the chilling air that came with nightfall. I stopped only once, just long enough to pull my headlamp from my bag and adjust my grip. The narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, bouncing across tree trunks and brush, catching fleeting glimpses of eyeshine. Deer, maybe, hopefully. The cold deepened, sinking through my clothes into my bones. I could feel the man shivering against me, even in his state, and that kept me moving. I talked to him as I walked, murmuring half-coherent encouragements. "Hang in there. We're getting close. You're not alone." I don't know if he heard me, but I had to say it, for him and maybe for me. The sounds of the forest were no longer comforting. Twigs snapped unexpectedly, leaves rustled in patterns that didn't match the wind, and every shadow felt alive. I wasn't just carrying a man anymore. I was carrying fear, exhaustion, and a quiet, gnawing doubt. What if I didn't make it in time? What if he slipped away while I was still fighting the terrain? My legs ached. My knees buckled more than once, and on a steep section, I nearly collapsed altogether. But each time I forced myself upright again. I had one job now. Not to guide, not to explore, but to deliver. Him and me. Together we pressed forward through the dark. The ranger station was still miles away, and the night was only getting colder. But I refused to stop. The forest could test me all it might. Wanted. I wasn't letting this man die out here. When the ranger station's lights finally came into view through the trees, I nearly cried. My legs were shaking, every muscle trembling from strain, but that soft yellow glow pushed me forward, like a beacon. I stumbled into the clearing, barely able to call out, my voice hoarse and raw. "Help!" I managed to croak, and within seconds 2 rangers burst through the front door, their eyes widening when they saw me. They rushed to my side as I slowly knelt, lowering the man to the ground with what strength I had left. My knees hit the dirt. I couldn't get back up. The rangers sprang into action, checking his vitals, radioing for an ambulance, lifting him onto a stretcher. I sat on a nearby bench, too tired to speak, my hands numb, my chest heaving. One of them handed me a blanket and said, "You did good." I just nodded, unable to meet his eyes. My vision blurred, the adrenaline finally ebbing. All I could think was, he's alive. Somehow, Against the odds, we'd made it. The forest hadn't beaten us, not tonight, and as they wheeled him inside, I leaned back, let the cold air wash over me, and let myself feel the weight of everything I'd carried. I stayed the night on a cot in the ranger station, staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The room was warm, the air still, but my body ached with ghost weight. I couldn't even picture his face clearly anymore, just the heaviness of him on my back, the sound of his shallow breathing in my ear, the way every step felt like a decision not to quit. That sensation has stayed with me more than any image or name. I don't remember what he looked like, but I'll never forget how it felt to carry him through the dark. Story 4. Julie and Lollie. A murder amid serene nature. It was a quiet Sunday in late May of 1996 when Julie Williams and Lollie Winans set out on what should have been a peaceful hiking trip through Shenandoah National Park. Accompanied by their golden retriever Taj, the couple planned to spend a few days immersed in nature, away from cities, pressure, judgment. They were both experienced in the outdoors, both drawn to wild spaces not just for the scenery, but for the freedom it offered. Julie, a vibrant geologist and tennis champion from Minnesota, had a sharp mind and a passion for exploring the unknown. Lollie, known for her love of microbrews, fishing, and fearless independence, had chosen a path far from the privileged life she was born into. The two had met at Woodswomen Inc., a non-profit dedicated to empowering women through outdoor adventure. Their bond had deepened over shared trails, campfire conversations, and the quiet understanding of two souls who had finally found home in each other. That day they followed a horse trail deep into the forest, setting up camp near a Serene mountain, a stream just off the bridle trail, a stretch known more to locals than tourists. The sun filtered through new spring leaves, and Taj padded happily beside them, tail wagging. It was the kind of day that promised nothing but peace. No one could have imagined it would be their last. That two women who came for solitude and love would walk unknowingly into the shadows of one of the park's darkest secrets. Days passed, and no one heard from Julie or Lollie. It wasn't unusual for hikers to go off-grid for a while, especially experienced ones, but when May 31st arrived and the women failed to return as planned, concern turned to fear. Julie's father, Thomas Williams, was the first to raise the alarm. He hadn't received a call, hadn't seen her car. He contacted the park authorities, his voice tight with worry. Rangers launched a search, combing through the trails near Skyland Lodge, where the women's vehicle had been found parked and undisturbed. Taj, their golden retriever, was discovered wandering near the trail without his leash, confused but unhurt. It was a strange and haunting sight. Taj never strayed from Julie. He had been her shadow on every hike. The search intensified, with rangers following paths, scanning campsites, and interviewing fellow hikers. Still, there was no sign of the women, no gear left behind, no answer to their names called into the trees. The feeling that something was wrong seeped deeper with every passing hour. Deputy Chief Ranger Bridget Bonner described those first searches as frantic and desperate. "We started doing hasty sweeps," she recalled, covering all the nearby trail corridors just to find anything, a clue, a footprint, even a scrap of clothing. But nothing turned up. The forest, which had welcomed Julie and Lollie with quiet beauty just days before, now held its silence tightly. And in that silence, families and friends waited, hearts pounding, fearing the worst but still hoping for a miracle. They didn't know it yet, but that miracle wouldn't come. What they were waiting for had already happened. It was just hidden, out of sight, deep within the trees. On the morning of June 1st, 1996, searchers made a grim discovery in a remote area of Shenandoah National Park, roughly half a mile from where Julie and Lollie's car had been found. Nestled out of view from the trail, tucked behind a small embankment near a gentle mountain stream, was a secluded campsite, eerily still. There, investigators found the bodies of both women. The scene was brutal and deliberate. Lollie was discovered inside the tent, her wrists bound with duct tape, her mouth gagged, and her throat slit. Julie's body was located some 30 to 40 feet away down the slope, similarly bound and gagged. Her sleeping bag and sleeping pad had been dragged with her, suggesting she may have tried to escape or was moved before or after her death. Both women were partially undressed, but there was no evidence of sexual assault. The dog Taj had not been harmed, and their camping equipment was mostly undisturbed, adding a chilling sense of intention to the violence. Whoever had done this hadn't acted in a frenzy. This had been controlled, calculated, a choice. Rangers and federal law enforcement quickly sealed the area, and the FBI was brought in. The remote location and compliance with park regulations, requiring backcountry campers to stay out of sight, had inadvertently concealed the crime from nearby hikers during those critical early days. Even more disturbing, authorities delayed the public announcement of the murders by over 36 hours, despite the fact that the park was bustling with Memorial Day visitors who could have been at risk. Acting Park Superintendent Greg Stiles called it an isolated incident, though no suspect had yet been identified, and no explanation was given for his confidence. For the officers and investigators who first arrived, the shock of the scene was unforgettable. It wasn't just the horror of the act, it was the contrast. Two vibrant, intelligent women had come here for peace, for joy, for love. And they had met something cruel and methodical, something that had waited in the trees until the right moment to strike. The forest, once a haven, had become a silent witness to an unspeakable act. As the shock settled and the investigation began, attention turned to a man named Darrell David Rice. He wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. In July 1997, just over a year after the murders, Rice attempted to abduct a Canadian cyclist in Shenandoah National Park. He had forced her off the road along Skyline Drive and was caught shortly after, with restraints found in his vehicle. The parallels were alarming. Rice was a single man in his late 20s, with no criminal record at the time, but a documented history of aggressive behavior, disturbing conduct at work, and a deep hostility toward women. Surveillance placed him inside the park around the time of Julie and Lollie's disappearance, on May 25th and 26th. He denied being there, but his own statements were inconsistent. The FBI believed they had found their man. In 2001, then Attorney General John Ashcroft announced Rice's indictment for the murders, alleging that he targeted the women based on their perceived sexual orientation. But the case was thin. It leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence, speculation, and psychological profiling. A troubling issue emerged when DNA testing on a hair found at the scene failed to match Rice. Years later, more advanced YSTR DNA analysis of the duct tape used to bind Lollie's wrists also excluded him. Defense attorneys pushed back hard, citing weak forensic links, unreliable witness statements, and possible investigative misconduct. In 2004, a judge dismissed the charges without prejudice, meaning Rice could still be charged again if new evidence surfaced, but for the time being the case fell apart. For the families of Julie and Lollie, it was a devastating blow. They had been told the killer was found, only to watch him slip through legal cracks. Meanwhile, the forest stood unchanged, green, endless, and indifferent, and somewhere the true killer remained free, hidden behind the leaves, or perhaps long gone, like footprints washed away by rain. For nearly 3 decades, the case remained unsolved, a haunting cold file filled with heartbreak, false leads, and unanswered questions. But in June 2024, everything changed. Through re-evaluation of the evidence and the use of advanced forensic technology, investigators finally identified the man responsible for the brutal murders of Julie Williams and Lollie Winans, Walter Leo Jackson Sr., a convicted rapist with a violent past. Jackson had died years earlier, never facing justice for what he did in Shenandoah National Park. His DNA had never been in the national database at the time of the original investigation, and it wasn't until new methods of DNA profiling were used on preserved evidence, including the duct tape used to bind Lollie, that a match was finally made. The announcement hit like a shockwave. Families were informed first. The FBI then went public with the update, confirming that Jackson acted alone and that there was no longer an active threat to the public. For the families of Julie and Lollie, the news offered a strange kind of closure, not healing perhaps, but an answer. They had long suspected that Rice wasn't the right man, that something about the prosecution hadn't fit. Now finally, they knew the truth. Julie and Lollie hadn't died at the hands of someone they knew or because of who they loved. They had been targeted by a violent predator, random, brutal, and opportunistic. Justice had come too late for a trial, but not too late for the truth to emerge from the silence. Julie and Lollie came to the forest not just as hikers, but as two women in love, seeking solitude, freedom, and a space to simply exist without judgment. They pitched their tent near a quiet stream, shared meals beneath the trees, and fell asleep beneath the stars, believing they were safe. But the wilderness, vast and indifferent, swallowed them whole. For years their story drifted between headlines and silence, their names spoken in whispers by those who loved them and remembered what was lost. Now, even with the truth revealed, that ache lingers. Their love was quiet, brave, and beautiful. Yet, it ended in cruelty and shadow. The trail they walked is still there, the trees still standing. But for those who know their story, the forest will never feel quite the same. Julie and Lollie did not disappear. They were taken. And though justice came late, their memory walks every path they once dared to tread. Story 5. Chris Fowler. Disappearance without a trace. Chris Fowler wasn't the kind of man to take life lightly. At 30, he had already lived through structure and discipline, having served in the military where routine and preparation were second nature. But after returning to civilian life, something in him shifted. The world felt too quiet, too ordinary. His days were spent in front of a computer or in line at grocery stores, surrounded by walls and expectations that felt too small. So he set his sights on the Pacific Crest Trail, 2,650 miles of raw wilderness stretching from the Canadian border to the edge of Mexico. It wasn't just a hike, it was a challenge, a test of endurance and solitude, and for Chris, a calling. He planned obsessively, checking gear lists, resupplying strategies, and elevation charts. Friends described him as methodical, resourceful, and calm under pressure, the kind of person you'd want next to you in a crisis. In early April of 2016, Chris began his journey at the trail's southern terminus near Campo, California. He documented his progress regularly on social media, sharing breathtaking photos, daily reflections, and GPS locations to keep friends and family reassured. It started out exactly as he had imagined: quiet, beautiful, demanding. He made friends along the way, exchanged trail tips, and seemed to thrive in the simplicity of walking and surviving. But somewhere between his steps and the silence of the forest, something shifted. And after May 3rd, Chris Fowler was never heard from again. For nearly a month, Chris's updates were like clockwork. Photos of wind-swept ridgelines, meals cooked over small camp stoves, notes about weather, wildlife, and the fellow hikers he met along the way. Then, without warning, everything stopped. His last post came on May 3rd, a brief message to another hiker saying he was near Castle Crags, a jagged and dramatic formation in Northern California, known both for its beauty and its isolation. It wasn't unusual for hikers to go dark for a day or two when reception dropped out. But by the end of that week, Chris still hadn't resurfaced. No new photos, no GPS pings, no messages. His family and friends grew uneasy. He'd always been careful, always left breadcrumbs for others to follow. Concern turned to fear when even scheduled resupply locations, places where hikers pick up food boxes they've mailed ahead, went untouched. The packages waited unclaimed. Chris Fowler had simply vanished. Calls were made. The Shasta County Sheriff's Department was contacted. Search and rescue teams were mobilized, combing miles of rugged trail and offshoot paths near Castle Crags. They used dogs, helicopters, drones. Flyers went up in nearby towns. Fellow hikers who'd crossed paths with him reported nothing unusual, no signs of injury or distress. It was as if the trail had opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. One moment, he was navigating switchbacks, beneath towering cliffs. The next, he was gone, leaving only silence, an unanswered message, and the unsettling mystery of how someone so prepared could disappear without a trace. The search for Chris Fowler became one of the most exhaustive missing hiker operations in Northern California that year. What made it so maddening wasn't just the sheer scale of the terrain, it was the absolute absence of anything. No gear, no clothing, no footprints, no shelter remnants, nothing. It was as if Chris had stepped off the trail and vanished into thin air. Search and rescue teams fanned out from his last known location at Castle Crags, creating grids and meticulously sweeping each area. Helicopters scanned for signs of movement or color contrast against the green and gray canopy. Ground teams followed natural water sources, cliffs, and hidden ravines. Trained dogs were brought in to track scent trails. They found nothing. Even experienced rangers admitted how strange it was. If Chris had suffered an accident, a fall, a misstep, exposure, something would have surfaced: a torn strap, a hiking pole, a scrap of fabric. He carried an 80-liter pack with weeks' worth of gear. None of it was ever recovered. There were no signs of wildlife disturbance, no drag marks or blood trails, no belongings discarded in haste. It was as if he had been lifted clean out of the woods. Some began to speculate darker possibilities: encounter with a hostile stranger, an act of violence hidden deep in the forest. Others wondered if Chris had intentionally vanished, staging his disappearance to escape something no one could see. But for those who knew him, that idea didn't sit right. Chris had been meticulous, grounded. He wasn't reckless. He didn't run. And if something had gone wrong, he would have fought to leave behind a clue, anything, to help someone find him. Instead, all the forest gave back was silence. Weeks passed. The official search was called off. But for his family, friends, and the tight-knit hiking community who had followed his journey, the questions only grew louder. How could a man so prepared, so experienced, disappear in a place he respected deeply? And how could a trail so well trodden leave behind no story, no hint, no ending? Chris's disappearance didn't mark the end of his journey. It simply passed the weight of it onto those who loved him. His parents, devastated but determined, refused to let his name fade into another unsolved wilderness mystery. They organized annual hikes in his memory, retracing sections of the Pacific Crest Trail near Castle Crags, hoping to jog a memory, catch a detail someone had missed, or cross paths with someone who had seen something, anything. Flyers were reprinted year after year, new photos added, descriptions updated. Social media pages were launched, not just to keep the story alive, but to remind the world that Chris had not been forgotten. Friends who had hiked alongside him early in the Trail shared stories online and in podcasts, speaking of his calm demeanor, his love for solitude, and how he always made others feel safe. None of them believed he had simply chosen to disappear. The grief took different forms: restlessness, obsession, quiet mourning. Some hoped for a miracle, that maybe he'd emerge from the woods one day with a wild tale of survival. Others accepted the quieter possibility that the forest had taken him in its own silent way. But all of them kept walking, through their pain, through their doubt, because that's what Chris would have done. He was never one to give up, and neither were they. In the stillness of pine groves and the rustle of wind against ridges, they searched for something more elusive than answers. They searched for presence, for memory, for invisible hope that maybe somehow part of him was still out there. Years have passed, but Chris Fowler's absence still lingers like a breath held too long. His case remains open, his trail unfinished. No body, no belongings, no goodbyes, just a gap in the map, where a man once walked with purpose. And it's not just his family or friends who feel the void. Among hikers, rangers, and wilderness guides, Chris's story has become something more than a mystery. It's a quiet haunting, the kind that echoes in rustling leaves and empty trail markers. Because when someone disappears in the woods, it doesn't just leave behind questions. It leaves behind a fracture in the people who remain. Every unexplained absence reminds us of how fragile the line is between being found and being forgotten. For those who hike the Pacific Crest Trail now, Chris is both cautionary tale and ghostly companion. His face appears on bulletin boards, at ranger stations, his name whispered among strangers who share water at backcountry camps. And in those remote stretches of forest where the trees grow close and the silence deepens, some swear they feel it, that sense of being watched, not by something sinister, but by someone searching for a way home. When someone vanishes in the woods, one ranger once said, a part of the rest of us disappears too. Chris walked into the wilderness hoping to test his limits. In doing so, he reminded us of something far greater, that even the most prepared, the most disciplined, can still be swallowed by the unknown, and leave the rest of us wondering what it means to truly be lost. Story 6. The journalist murdered in Gallatin Forest. Ethan Grant was no amateur. A seasoned freelance journalist from Denver, he had built his career on adventure reporting, writing about everything from ice climbing in the Rockies to storm chasing across the Midwest. In the summer of 2015, he set his sights on Gallatin National Forest in Montana to research a new trend: solo wilderness camping. It was supposed to be a personal story, something reflective and immersive. He told friends he was excited, craving solitude, silence, and the clarity that came from disconnecting. He packed light but smart with a tent, a journal, a camera, and enough supplies for several days. His last communication was a short text to his editor. Made it. Setting up camp by the river. Feels perfect out here. But when Ethan failed to check in days later, his editor grew concerned. A call to local authorities sparked the first wave of search efforts. Rangers expected to find a hiker who had maybe twisted an ankle or gotten off course, not what they eventually discovered. What began as a routine missing person case quickly shifted into something far darker. Ethan Grant hadn't just vanished, he had been found, and what they found was nothing short of horrifying. Mark Hendrick had been guiding for over a decade and thought he'd seen it all. Animal encounters, weather emergencies, panicked hikers, but nothing prepared him for what he stumbled upon that August morning in 2015. He was scouting ahead of a multi-day trek through Gallatin National Forest, checking trail conditions along a stretch near the river, when something odd caught his eye. A campsite that looked hastily abandoned. A camp chair was overturned, a fire pit still faintly smoldering, and a sleeping bag lay crumpled near the tree line. Something felt wrong. As he stepped closer, the smell hit him first. Metallic, unmistakable. Then he saw the body. A man slumped near the riverbank, motionless. His throat had been slashed, and multiple stab wounds covered his chest and sides. Blood stained the rocks and nearby foliage, dry but still vivid against the green. Mark froze. For a long second, the forest was completely silent, as if it too were holding its breath. When he finally moved, it was only to back away and radio the rangers, his voice trembling as he gave his location. Authorities arrived within the hour, and soon the quiet riverside was filled with investigators, tape, and cameras. The man was quickly identified as Ethan Grant. His journal was found in his tent. Its final entry dated the night of August 12th, just hours, they believed, before the attack. The pages ended mid-sentence. Whatever had happened out here wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fall or a bear or exposure. It was murder, sudden, violent, and terrifyingly intentional. And it had happened in the heart of one of Montana's most beloved wilderness areas. As investigators combed through the crime scene, a potential lead surfaced from a pair of hikers who had passed through the area the day before Ethan Grant's body was found. They described a man they'd encountered on a nearby trail, disheveled, jittery, and unusually aggressive. He had approached them asking for food and cigarettes, and when they refused, his demeanor turned tense, his eyes twitching with agitation. He carried a heavy, ragged backpack and smelled of sweat and wood smoke. He hadn't introduced himself, and something about him left both hikers deeply unsettled. Their description fit a known drifter by the name of Thomas Blake, a 45-year-old transient with a history of petty crimes, including assault and theft. Blake had been seen around the edges of Gallatin National Forest for years, camping illegally and avoiding rangers. He was known for his hostility toward authority and erratic behavior, especially when off his medication, if he was taking any at all. Authorities tracked his last known location to an abandoned shelter site just beyond, the river valley. When they apprehended him days later, he was still wearing the same clothes and carrying the same backpack. Inside, they found traces of blood. Tests later confirmed it matched Ethan Grant's. At first, Blake denied any involvement, spinning vague stories about being miles away or never seeing some journalist. But the evidence was too strong to ignore. Confronted with the DNA, Blake eventually changed his story. He claimed it had been self-defense, that he had approached Grant's camp peacefully, only for an argument to escalate. But as investigators dug deeper, that version unraveled. The wounds told a different story, one of rage, not desperation. Blake wasn't a man trying to survive. He was a man who had snapped. And Ethan Grant had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The trial of Thomas Blake began in early 2006 and quickly drew attention across Montana. In a small courtroom shadowed by mountains, the drifter stood accused of murdering Ethan Grant in cold blood. Blake's defense leaned heavily on his claim of self-defense, painting a picture of a desperate man who had approached Grant's campsite simply seeking help, only to be met with hostility. They described him as mentally unstable, unmedicated, and driven by fear and hunger. But the prosecution dismantled that narrative piece by piece. They brought in forensic experts who detailed the nature of the wounds: multiple stab injuries, a clean throat slash, and no defensive wounds on Grant's body. There were no signs of a struggle at the camp, no bruises or scattered gear, no overturned tent. It wasn't a fight. It was an ambush. Prosecutors also emphasized Blake's history, his previous assaults, his unpredictable behavior, and his consistent refusal to seek help even when it was available. Witnesses recalled his volatile temper, his violent outbursts, and the chilling indifference he'd shown after the murder. The prosecution argued that Grant, a quiet man writing about solitude and nature, had simply been a target of opportunity. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Blake was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. For many, it wasn't just justice for Ethan. It was a reminder that even in the most serene places, danger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply walks into your camp and waits. I didn't know Ethan Grant personally, but finding his body changed something in me. Before that day, I treated the wilderness as a sanctuary, a place ruled by weather and wildlife, not people. But since then, I've never gone out without a radio clipped to my chest and bear spray within arm's reach. Not just for animals, but for the unpredictable human kind. I still lead tours through Gallatin, still teach others how to respect the wild, but there's a different tone now. I tell them it's not just about knowing how to build a fire or pitch a tent. It's about reading people, trusting instincts, and never assuming you're alone. The forest is vast, beautiful, and unforgiving, and while most who walk its trails come for peace, all it takes is one person, just one, to turn a quiet morning into a nightmare. That's a truth I carry with me every step I take. Story 7. The Grim Reaper Guide. Long before he became one of the most terrifying figures in Alaska's criminal history, Robert Hansen was just a quiet, awkward boy growing up in the small town of Esterville, Iowa. Born in 1939 to a strict Danish immigrant father who ran a bakery, Robert's childhood was dominated by harsh discipline and emotional neglect. He spent his early years working long hours in the family business, often in silence, often alone. As he entered adolescence, things worsened. He developed a severe stutter and acne so extreme that his face was often covered in angry welts. He became a target for bullying, especially from girls whose rejections hit the deepest nerve. Those wounds never healed, instead they festered. While other boys chased baseball dreams or went to dances, Robert fantasized about revenge, not just on those who mocked him, but on a world that he believed had humiliated him. He began to develop a secret inner world, one where he was the one in control, where he could dominate and punish without consequence. He took up hunting, and it quickly became more than a hobby. It was precision. It was power. Animals couldn't laugh or talk back. They simply ran, and he pursued them through the wilderness like a shadow. In time, that fantasy bled into darker desires. The skill of tracking, the thrill of the chase, the moment of absolute control, all of it built a foundation for something horrific. Robert Hansen's twisted motivations were born not from a sudden snap, but from a slow, calculated build-up, an identity formed in silence, resentment, and the cold logic of someone who believed the world owed him something. And in the brutal emptiness of the Alaskan wilderness, he would soon find the perfect place to make those fantasies real. By the time Robert Hansen moved to Anchorage, Alaska, in the late 1960s, he had crafted the image of a quiet, hard-working man. He opened a small bakery on a sleepy street, waking early to knead dough and greet customers with soft-spoken politeness. He married, raised 2 children, and became a familiar face around town. To neighbors, he was nothing more than a humble baker who kept to himself and loved to hunt on the weekends. He attended church, paid his taxes, and offered free pastries to local charities. Anchorage was a growing city, and Hansen fit neatly into its fabric, unremarkable, trustworthy, invisible. No one saw the cracks beneath that facade. No one questioned why he chose to hunt in the most remote parts of the state, or why he kept to himself even when surrounded by friendly faces. Beneath the apron and warm smile was a man still burning with resentment, still haunted by the rejections of his youth. The bakery was more than a job, it was a mask, and it worked. Because no one ever suspects the man who brings muffins to Sunday service. No one expects the quietest guy in the room to be hiding a monstrous hunger. Robert Hansen's method was as horrifying as it was calculated. Under the guise of being a soft-spoken, generous man, he carefully selected his victims from Anchorage's seedier side, mostly sex workers and exotic dancers, women whose disappearances would often go unnoticed or unreported. He'd lure them in with promises of money, a modeling opportunity, or a private job. Sometimes he simply offered them a ride. Once they entered his home, the trap closed. Inside his quiet suburban house, Hansen would restrain and assault them, his calm demeanor replaced by terrifying control. But the true horror began after that. For many of his victims, he didn't kill them immediately. Instead, he drove them to a private airstrip where his small bush plane waited. He'd fly them into the remote wilderness along the Nick River, landing in areas far from civilization, miles of brutal, unforgiving terrain. There, in the middle of nowhere, Hansen released them. Not to escape, to run. He gave them a head start, just enough to build hope and fear, then stalked them through the brush with a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. He moved through the woods like he had with animals for years, calm, methodical, patient. Except this time his prey screamed. He hunted these women like game, tracking them through the trees, watching them panic, stumble, fall, and when he was done, he executed them and left their bodies to the elements. Sometimes he returned to the sites days later, collecting trophies, jewelry, ID cards, tokens. Back home, he marked the burial spots on a detailed aviation map with tiny red X's, a chilling archive of his kills. Between 1971 and 1983, it's believed Hansen murdered at least 17 women and assaulted dozens more. For over a decade, no one suspected the quiet baker with the kind eyes and the plane. In a land where the wilderness is endless and silence stretches for miles, Hansen created his own twisted hunting ground, and no one was watching. He wasn't just killing, he was playing God in a forest that answered to no one. Cindy Paulson was just 17 when she became the one victim Robert Hansen couldn't silence. In June of 1983, Hansen had picked her up in Anchorage, promising her a large sum of money for a quick job. Instead, he took her to his home, chained her by the neck in his basement, and subjected her to hours of assault. But unlike the others, Cindy saw an opportunity and took it. When Hansen briefly left her alone, she escaped. Barefoot and terrified, she ran into the street, waving down a passing truck driver who brought her to safety. She was frantic, bleeding, and shaken, but she spoke clearly. She gave the police Hansen's name, a description of his house, and even details of his plane. At first, detectives hesitated. Hansen had no violent criminal record. He was a respected business owner, a husband, a father. It didn't fit. But Cindy wouldn't back down. Her testimony was too detailed, her fear too real. Eventually, detectives dug deeper, and what they found would crack the case wide open. With a search warrant, they combed through Hansen's home. Hidden in the crawl space, they uncovered weapons, women's jewelry that didn't belong to his wife, and, most damning, of all his aviation map covered in red X's, each X marked a kill site. With Cindy's bravery, the facade of Robert Hansen finally collapsed. Her escape didn't just save her own life, it exposed the monster Anchorage had unknowingly embraced for over a decade. She became the voice for the silenced, and the reason. Justice finally took flight. Once authorities gained access to Robert Hansen's home, the myth of the mild-mannered baker unraveled with disturbing speed. The most damning piece of evidence was a detailed aviation map found hidden in the ceiling tiles of his house. On it were dozens of tiny red X marks scattered across remote regions of the Alaskan wilderness, each corresponding to a body, a secret, grave, a life extinguished. With Cindy Paulson's testimony as their anchor, investigators retraced Hansen's flight logs and matched the X's to known missing persons reports. Many of the bodies were never recovered, claimed by the forest and its merciless elements, but the consistency of the locations, combined with jewelry belonging to victims found in Hansen's home, made the picture clear. During questioning, faced with overwhelming evidence, Hansen eventually confessed, not to 1 or 2 killings, but to 17 confirmed murders and dozens of assaults. He described his methods in chilling detail, showing no remorse. It was methodical, it was sport, and it had gone on for over a decade beneath the noses of neighbors and law enforcement. In 1984, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was quiet when the sentence was read, the weight of it sinking into every person who had once believed evil couldn't hide behind an apron and a smile. The map, the one with the red X's, was sealed into evidence, but its image lingered long after, burned into the memory of everyone who had seen it. It wasn't just a map of Alaska. It was a graveyard drawn by the killer's own hand. Even after Robert Hansen died in 2014 at the age of 75, the fear he sowed never fully faded. His story became a grim legend in Alaska, a whispered cautionary tale passed between wilderness guides, law enforcement, and locals who remembered how close evil had come. People still struggled to reconcile the kindly baker who handed out free pastries with the monster who hunted women for sport. That was the most haunting part. Not just the brutality of his crimes, but the way he lived among them unnoticed. A father, a churchgoer, a friend, all while hiding trophies of the dead beneath his floorboards. Hansen proved something terrifyingly simple, that evil doesn't always look like a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it smiles at you in the morning, sometimes it holds the door, sometimes it waves from across the street while knowing exactly where the bodies lie. In the years since, Anchorage has changed, the city remembers, and for those who venture into the wild, guides, travelers, loners seeking peace, his story remains a reminder that monsters don't just lurk in the woods. Sometimes they fly you there. Sometimes they bake your bread. Evil can wear the mask of goodness and live quietly right next door. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.